Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about John F. Kennedy, the most recent president to have died in office. So John F. Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, and he died November 22nd, 1963, at the age of 46. His home state is Massachusetts. His religion is Roman Catholic. And this is going to be quite important. There had only been one other major party candidate that ran as a Catholic, and that was Al Smith in 1928. And he had had serious electoral backlash over his faith, specifically in the South, which had been the area of support for his Democratic Party. So it is still going to be a big deal in 1960 when JFK is running as a Roman Catholic, but he is going to reduce some of the fears people had by very specifically talking about his belief in the separation of church and state, and that he would be a president for all of America, not just for Catholics. All right, so he's from a prominent family of the Kennedys, right? And his father was involved in all sorts of politics and behind the scenes stuff, and he had kind of prepped JFK's eldest brother to be the one that was going to run for president, the one that was going to have a successful political career. But his brother died during World War II, so then it fell to him. Right? So his wife, his first lady, Jackie Kennedy, who was a good bit younger than him, and later she remarries. Jackie Onassis. He has his brother Robert, who he's going to make Attorney General. And then he's going to run for president in his own right and be assassinated in 1968 before he could be the nominee. And then his brother Ted Kennedy, who's going to take up his old Senate seat in Massachusetts. And he's going to hold that for a very long time, only dying in the Obama administration. And Ted Kennedy's going to run for president a couple different times unsuccessfully. So in all, he's from a prominent family in the past, even to today. So in my party, he was a Democrat. And term of office is from January 20th, 1961 to November 22nd, 1963. Assuming most people, when they clicked on this, they understood that he does not finish his term, but some ominous signs when he doesn't have a full time in office and early death. His vice president is Lyndon Johnson, who was quite a different person than him. He was a Southern Protestant Democrat who had been in a much more moderate faction of the party than the Northern Liberal Kennedy. It was a marriage of convenience when they got put together. So, JFK is going to be in World War II. And he's going to fight in World War II. I said his brother died, but he is going to survive. And he's going to use that afterwards to get elected to the U.S. House in he's going to take the seat in 1947. So he wins in 46 in Massachusetts. And then just a few years later, in 1952, he is going to dislodge Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. And flip the Senate seat in Massachusetts to the Democrats. In 1956, Adlai Stevenson gets the Democratic nomination for president, The question is who's going to be his running mate. He'd already run in 1952, a guy called Sparkman. They're looking for a new one, and JFK puts his name out there as a running mate for Adlai Stevenson, and ends up not going to him. And that ticket loses in a landslide, and Kennedy's father is very upset for him for doing that because that could have upset his his way to get to become president if you had been on this losing ticket. So while he's in the Senate, Kennedy published a book called Profiles in Courage, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a pretty open secret now today. He didn't actually write that book. It had a ghostwriter. But the public thought it was. All right. So in 1960, he gets the nomination on the Democratic side. His opponent is Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president. And it's a tough environment to be in because Eisenhower, the Republican president, is still quite popular. So one thing that's going to change there is that he participates in the first presidential debate that is a general election debate that's televised. And there are several leads between Kennedy and Nixon. But Kennedy, he is younger, more photogenic, and he plays well to the television camera. Right? Nixon comes off as being a lot more uncomfortable, and he really messes up like his makeup on the debate, so it doesn't show up very well. And so Kennedy's using the new medium of television to help broadcast his message. So this being a televised campaign is going to really help Kennedy. So he is going to become president in an incredibly close election, right? In which a very small amount of votes in Illinois and Texas are going to put him over the top in the Electoral College. Both states at the time that were kind of notorious for some underhanded stuff happening with elections. But he becomes president, and he is the youngest person elected president. Theodore Roosevelt was younger, but he became president because he was vice president and he got elevated. So at the time of the Cold War, and the biggest thing that Kennedy's going to have to face is a communist Cuba with Fidel Castro. And so the United States is going to try a bunch of different ways to get rid of Castro, all of them unsuccessful. But one that they're going to orchestrate is a thing called the Bay of Pigs invasion, where they get a bunch of Cuban exiles and they try to land an area that in English is called the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. And they were hoping that it would start a popular revolt. But this gets found out and it's a total disaster. And JFK has to basically maroon them and leave them there. This leads to Cuba wanting to deter the U.S. from intervening and trying to get nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. This leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. At this point, they don't have the technology to be sending missiles effectively all across the world we do today. And so the Soviet missile threat is much smaller than in Cuba, where they're quite close to Florida. They could hit a major American city. So negotiating away from nuclear annihilation. If any of the leaders in Cuba, the United States, or the Soviet Union had taken a big misstep, if they had not been willing to talk, compromise, deal with this, it could have led to nuclear disaster. JFK manages to get a deal in which the U.S. stops intervening with Cuba and will eventually move our missiles out of Turkey for exchange for those being removed out of Cuba publicly by the Soviet Union. Right? So it is the time of the Cold War. So he's going to go to Germany. He's going to give a very famous speech where he says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," like I am someone from Berlin. He stands with them. One of the things that he's going to promise is getting a man on the moon by the end of the decade. It's the 1960s. He's not going to live to that point. But in 1969, we get a man on the moon. So they do fulfill his promise even after he died. And then Kennedy was taking steps towards civil rights, right, for African Americans during that movement. And his death, with Lyndon Johnson ascending to the presidency, is going to lead to a lot of their passage. Last bit about Kennedy. He is the last president that was assassinated. Right, so he goes to visit Texas in November of 1963. He is riding through Dallas in an open-air limousine, and then when 3 shots are fired at him, one misses, one hits him, and it will go through and actually hit the governor as well, and then one will hit him in the head. Right? And though they attempt to save his life, AFK does not survive, and he dies. And so the person that assassinated him was a guy called Lee Harvey Oswald. There's going to be all sorts of conspiracies and investigations afterwards trying to figure this out, whether Oswald acted alone. Right? The report out of Congress, the Warren Commission, is going to say that that he acted alone. One of the things that will lead to more suspicions is that a man called Jack Ruby is going to shoot and kill Lee Harvey Oswald 3 days later. But the country is devastated. Kennedy had him, his young wife, young family at the White House, somebody they hadn't seen in quite a bit of time, made for TV, and he was killed. And so the nation mourns. So when you look at like historical rankings of presidents, it's quite often you find Kennedy in the top 10. And it's really hard to give him a good ranking because it's hard to separate the tragedy of how he died and the what could have been of his presidency with what actually occurred. So the Kennedy family is going to stay prominent in politics all the way up to today. And so that is the story of JFK. Right, so next in class, we will talk about his immediate successor, one Lyndon Johnson.